Temporal drift, the chronicles of a shattered era. The world as it is now is not what it once seemed. There are whispers, fragments of memories, stories passed down like threads from a time that no longer exists. The world of 2053 is something almost alien to those who had witnessed the bright, fast-paced days of the early 21st century. Some of the greatest minds of the past, like Newton and Tesla, were said to have seen glimpses of the future. What they couldn't predict, however, was the catalyst, something that would trigger the collapse of time itself. The story began on a stormy night in London, a city as old as time itself. The rain fell heavily, as it had for generations. The streets were awash with neon lights from the latest tech ads, flickering in the reflections of puddles. Yet, amidst the hum of technology, an eerie silence had begun to creep into the lives of the people. People still drove the latest sleek Tesla vehicles, but they began to notice something strange. The traffic lights weren't in sync. A minor detail, but a sign of the dissonance slowly creeping into their world. In the heart of this strange temporal distortion was the unlikely figure of Francisco, a mild-mannered software engineer by day, whose nights were spent uncovering forgotten pieces of history. While others were content with the comforts of modern technology, Francisco was obsessed with the idea that time itself could be altered. His nights were spent deciphering codes, not just on computers, but on ancient manuscripts that he'd stumbled upon during his travels to places like the Library of Alexandria and even the obscure remnants of the Incan Empire. He'd heard the legends of the time travelers, those who had come before him, from a future they couldn't truly describe. Their stories spoke of portals and rifts in time, the result of a secret project initiated by none other than the now-forgotten Apple Corporation, which had once stood at the forefront of the tech industry. But as the world of high-tech smartphones and electric vehicles like the Ford Mach-E had faded into the distance, the true power of those corporations was now a hidden memory. One evening, as Francisco worked late in his dimly lit office, a strange crackling sound filled the room. He looked up, seeing the familiar blue glow of his computer screen flicker before turning into an array of static. And then it happened. A rift, an opening in the fabric of space-time itself. Francisco's breath caught in his chest as the rift swirled, pulling him in with a force he couldn't resist. With a sudden jolt, Francisco found himself standing in the middle of a desert, an unknown place where the sun burned with an intensity he had never seen. He had heard stories of this place, the ancient land of Egypt, a civilization that had risen and fallen long before the first modern cities were born. But this wasn't Egypt as he knew it. This was a different time, one where history wasn't just recorded, it was being rewritten. In front of him, a towering figure appeared. A man wearing garments that belonged to a time long past, yet he spoke as if he had just stepped out of a futuristic world. His eyes gleamed with the knowledge of someone who had traveled through time, perhaps even the same rift that Francisco had just crossed. His name was Horace, a man who had been given the task of guarding the timeline itself. And it was Horace who told Francisco that the rift he had entered was a fragment, a tear in time caused by something, or someone, who had broken the rules of the timeline. "You are not the first," Horace said, his voice deep with the weight of centuries. "And you will not be the last." Francisco stood in the heat of the desert, trying to comprehend what Horace had just revealed. He had read countless theories about time travel, paradoxes, and timelines, but this was something entirely different. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust, and the sound of wind swept across the barren landscape. The world around him shimmered, as though the very ground beneath his feet was warping. "You may not understand it now," Horace continued, "but your arrival here in this place is not an accident. The timeline is fragile, and you, Francisco, are now part of a story that spans centuries. The past, present, and future are converging, and it is your role to restore the balance." Francisco's heart raced. What balance? He hadn't asked for any of this. He wasn't a hero, just a man who stumbled upon something he didn't fully understand. But as the words of Horace sunk in, he realized that his journey had only just begun. The desert stretched out endlessly, but in the distance, Francisco could make out the silhouette of an ancient pyramid, a structure that had stood the test of time. The Pyramid of Giza, or at least, that's what it seemed like. But there was something strange about it. It wasn't just the size or the age. It was the way it seemed to pulse with an energy that was not of this world. Was this where it all started? Horace gestured toward the pyramid. "You will find the answers inside. But be warned, time is not as it seems. It bends and twists in ways you cannot fathom. Your every action here will send ripples through the ages." As Francisco approached the pyramid, he felt a strange sensation crawling up his spine. The air grew colder, and the shadows of the ancient stone walls seemed to flicker, as though they were not just moving but alive. He stepped inside, the echo of his footsteps reverberating in the dark, hollow chamber. And there, in the center of the room, stood a strange artifact, a device unlike anything he had ever seen. It was circular, with intricate markings that seemed to shift and change with every glance. The device pulsed with a faint light, and Francisco could feel it calling to him. But as he reached out to touch it, a vision flooded his mind, a vision of a world unlike any he had known. He saw a skyline, towering with structures that defied the laws of physics. The year was 2089. Cars no longer roared through the streets, for they had evolved into silent vehicles that glided on invisible tracks. People no longer used smartphones, but instead connected directly to the vast network of the world through neural interfaces. A massive billboard gleamed with the logo of a company that had once been a giant in the world of technology, Microsoft. But something was off. A disruption, a malfunction in the network. He was snapped out of the vision by a sudden shift in the room. The walls trembled, and the pyramid seemed to groan with age. The rift, something was wrong with the timeline. Horace appeared at his side once again, his expression grave. "You've seen the future," he said, his voice trembling. "But what you don't know is that the future you've seen is not set in stone. The very fabric of time is being rewritten by those who seek to control it." Horace looked into the distance, as though seeing something far beyond the desert. "And they are closer than you think." Francisco's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the vision. Was this what had caused the rift? The future, a future of unimaginable technology and innovation, was being threatened by forces he couldn't even begin to understand. He had been pulled into this, but why? And what was his role in this cosmic game of chess? As Francisco turned to face Horace, a familiar feeling crept up on him, a feeling that he was no longer in control of his own fate. It was as though the past, present, and future were all threads weaving into one massive tapestry, and he, a simple software engineer from London, was now the thread that might unravel it all. In the distance, a flash of light flickered in the sky. It wasn't a star, nor was it lightning. It was something else, a new rift, and it was calling to him. The flash of light in the sky became a beacon, drawing Francisco's gaze. It was as if the universe itself was signaling him, calling him to something beyond his comprehension. He turned to Horace, whose expression had shifted from concern to something more somber, almost resigned. The ancient guardian of time had seen this before, Francisco realized. This wasn't just a glitch in the timeline. It was an all-out disruption. "The rift is opening," Horace said, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and determination. "You must go, Francisco. The timeline needs you now more than ever." Francisco, still grappling with the enormity of his journey, could hardly comprehend what was happening. He had gone from a simple engineer with an obscure interest in history to the key player in a battle to save time itself. But there was no turning back now. He had crossed the threshold, and the rift was drawing him in. Without another word, Horace stepped aside, his presence an unspoken reminder of the weight of the task ahead. Francisco approached the rift, feeling the pull in his chest grow stronger with each step. The light from the rift engulfed him, and in an instant, the world around him shattered. He was no longer in the desert. The heat of the Egyptian sands was replaced by the cold, sterile air of a futuristic city. Towering structures of steel and glass surrounded him, their surfaces gleaming with the logos of companies that had risen and fallen in his own time. He stood in the middle of a bustling metropolis, an endless sea of people moving in sync with the pulse of the city. He had arrived in the future, in the year 2089. At first, it was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. People walked past him, their eyes fixed on their personal devices, but there was something eerie about their lack of expression. The city, for all its advanced technology, felt empty. The streets were quiet, despite the mass of people. It was as if everyone was trapped in their own digital worlds, oblivious to the world around them. In the distance, a massive holographic billboard flashed the latest advertisement from Tesla, showcasing their newest self-driving cars, sleek, aerodynamic vehicles gliding effortlessly through the streets. But there was no one driving them. They were just machines, autonomous and indifferent to the humans they transported. It was a world that had evolved far beyond the one Francisco had left behind. Yet it felt like something was missing. Human connection, perhaps? But there was no time to dwell on such thoughts. Francisco's mission was clear. He had to find the source of the disruption in the timeline, the forces that were manipulating time itself. He moved through the city, the hum of technology surrounding him, until he reached a building that stood out from the rest. A towering skyscraper with a familiar logo emblazoned across its surface. Microsoft. The company had once been a giant in the world of technology, and its logo was still a symbol of innovation. But now, it was more than just a tech giant. It was the heart of the disruption, the epicenter of the forces that had begun to manipulate time. The building was heavily guarded, with drones hovering above the entrance, scanning for any sign of unauthorized access. Francisco knew he had to get inside. But how? Just as he was about to turn and look for another way in, a voice came from behind him. A familiar voice, one that seemed to echo through the corridors of time itself. It was Horace, standing at the edge of the building, his presence as commanding as it had been in the desert. "The source of the rift is within," Horace said, his tone grim. "But be careful. The future you've entered is not the one you know. It has been altered, twisted by those who seek to control time." With that, Francisco knew there was no turning back. He had to confront whatever was inside that building, whatever had caused the timeline to break. He moved toward the entrance, the drones scanning him as he approached. But something was different now. The air seemed charged with energy, the building itself alive with the hum of technology. Inside, the corridors were sleek and modern, but the further he went, the more he felt the weight of the disruption pressing on him. The building was not just a hub of technology. It was a nexus, a point where the fabric of time was being manipulated. He reached the top floor, where a single door awaited him. The door was adorned with a symbol that he recognized, a symbol that had appeared in his vision back in the pyramid. It was the mark of a secret society that had been operating in the shadows for centuries. The society had known the secret of time travel long before anyone else. The door opened, and Francisco stepped inside. What he saw next would change everything. As Francisco stepped into the room, his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting. The walls were lined with intricate machines, their purpose unclear yet unmistakably advanced. At the center of the room stood a massive console, its surface alive with streams of data flashing across holographic screens. The technology was far beyond anything he had ever seen, even in the future. But what truly caught his attention was the figure standing before the console. A figure cloaked in shadows, their face hidden beneath a hood. It was then that Francisco realized the true nature of the disruption. This wasn't just about time travel. It was about control. The figure before him was manipulating the very essence of time, reshaping it to their will. They had learned to harness the rifts, to bend time to their advantage, and now they were using it to rewrite history itself. "You've come," the figure said, their voice a strange mix of familiarity and cold indifference. "I knew someone would. You are the catalyst, Francisco, the one who can either restore balance or tip the scales forever." Francisco felt his heart race. He had no idea who this person was, but they clearly knew him. More than that, they knew what he was capable of. He glanced at the console, where streams of data showed timelines folding in on themselves, looping and colliding in chaotic patterns. "What are you doing?" Francisco demanded, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "Why are you doing this?" The figure chuckled softly, the sound echoing eerily through the room. "Time is a river, Francisco. It flows in one direction, but it can be manipulated, rerouted. And the flow of time is the key to ultimate power. I am simply unlocking its true potential." Francisco stepped closer, his mind racing. He had to stop this. The future he had seen in his vision, the world of 2089, was crumbling, distorted by the very actions of this shadowy figure. The rift was not just a tear in time. It was a gateway, one that allowed them to rewrite history. But what would happen if the timeline was rewritten? What if the past was erased? What would become of the future? "You can't control time," Francisco said, though his voice trembled with doubt. "You're breaking it. You don't understand what you're doing." The figure's laugh deepened, and they turned to face Francisco fully. The hood fell back, revealing a familiar face, one he had seen only in old photographs. It was someone he recognized from his studies, someone whose actions had shaped the very course of history. It was none other than the founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates. "But I do understand," Bill Gates replied, his eyes glinting with the knowledge of someone who had seen beyond the limits of time. "I've seen it all, Francisco. I've seen the wars, the collapse, the rise of new powers. Time is not linear. It's a web, a network, just like the one we built with our technologies. And I intend to untangle it." Francisco's mind reeled as he processed the implications of Gates' words. The future he had glimpsed, the one of sleek Teslas and towering buildings, wasn't the end. It was a stepping stone, a world ripe for reshaping. The manipulation of time wasn't just about altering the past. It was about creating something entirely new. Suddenly, the console hummed to life, and the rift that had pulled Francisco into this strange future began to grow larger. The room seemed to shake as reality itself distorted. The timeline was fracturing before his eyes. "You can't stop it," Gates said, his voice cold. "I've already made the necessary changes. The future has already been altered." But Francisco wasn't about to give up. He had come too far, seen too much, to let the timeline be rewritten. With a surge of determination, he moved toward the console, his hands flying over the controls. The rift pulsed in response, its energy crackling around him. Time itself was a delicate balance, and Francisco knew that if he could just reach the right sequence, if he could just connect the dots of history, past, present, and future, he might be able to restore the timeline. But it wasn't enough to just fix it. He had to ensure that it stayed fixed. As the rift closed, a shockwave of energy blasted through the room, throwing both Francisco and Gates to the ground. The console flickered and then went dark. The air was still, the machine silent. The rift was gone, its power dissipating into the ether. Francisco rose to his feet, breathing heavily. He looked around the room, now eerily calm. Gates lay unconscious on the floor, the shadows of his ambitions fading into the past. The timeline had been restored, for now. But Francisco knew that the rifts in time would always be there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the next person to stumble upon them. The future wasn't set in stone, and it never would be. Time was a force, wild and unpredictable, and he had just become a part of it. As he stepped back into the world of 2053, Francisco couldn't help but wonder what other forces were out there, waiting for their moment. The universe was vast, and time, with all its mysteries, was far from over. The Everglades Paradox. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon when Theo stepped out of the Tesla Model S, its sleek metallic frame glistening under the faint glow of the streetlights. It had been a long journey from Miami, the hum of the electric engine still lingering in his ears as he surveyed the vast wilderness of the Everglades ahead. The once tranquil, untouched wetlands were now a place of eerie significance. In the past few weeks, strange occurrences had been reported: flickers of light, anomalies in the air, even unexplained disappearances. What was once a sanctuary for wildlife now felt like the edge of another world, a thin veil between what was and what could be. Theo wasn't sure if it was the heat that made the air shimmer, or if there was something more, something ancient and inexplicable that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment. Armed with a portable device from Sony, a cutting-edge quantum tracker, he stepped into the thick vegetation, following the readings it was providing. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, laden with essentials: water from Nestle, some protein bars for sustenance, and a portable charger from Anchor to ensure his devices never failed him in this remote expanse. The year was 2073, a time when humanity had long since harnessed the power of quantum technology, sending waves of influence through history. Theo wasn't a historian, but what he had stumbled upon here, in these swamps, felt like an unraveling of time itself. The device had hinted at something, an anomaly stretching back not just decades or centuries, but millennia, perhaps even further. As he walked, memories of old books he'd read flashed through his mind. Ancient stories of explorers who ventured into the swamps of Florida in the early 20th century, seeking to unravel the mysteries hidden beneath the swampy waters. These stories had always been tinged with myth. No one had ever returned to confirm their truths. Yet, what if those myths weren't merely stories? What if they were echoes of something more profound? Something beyond the understanding of the modern world, buried under layers of time? Suddenly, the device began to buzz, a sharp and consistent hum that pierced through the stillness of the night. Theo's heart raced. He took out the quantum tracker, examining its screen. The readings were off the charts, indicating an unknown anomaly. But it wasn't just an anomaly in space. It seemed to pulse through time itself. His curiosity propelled him further, pushing through the dense foliage as the shadows of the swamp seemed to stretch and twist around him. The air felt thicker now, as if the humidity itself was charged with the strange energy emanating from the tracker. Theo's thoughts raced with possibilities. Could this device actually detect temporal fluctuations? Had he stumbled upon something that allowed him to see across time? Or perhaps the Everglades themselves were harboring a portal, one that linked different eras in an unseen dance. The more he walked, the more the idea seemed plausible. The air shimmered as he continued, and it felt as though the swamp itself was alive with the whispers of the past. The farther he ventured into the heart of the swamp, the more unsettling the silence became. The usual chorus of frogs, insects, and distant birds was eerily absent. The only sound was the rustle of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional hum from his quantum tracker. The forest seemed to close in around him, and for a moment, he could have sworn the trees were watching him, their ancient limbs reaching out like fingers, silently urging him to move deeper. Theo pressed on, now feeling the weight of something unseen, as if an ancient power was watching over him. The tracker's readings continued to climb, its screen flashing bright bursts of green and blue. He reached the edge of a small clearing where the ground sloped downward, revealing a strange set of stone structures buried beneath vines and moss. The stones had a peculiar design, angular, with symbols etched into their surfaces, worn down by time. As Theo knelt to examine the stones, the device emitted a loud, high-pitched whine. The symbols on the stones seemed to pulse with an ethereal light. They were not just ancient carvings, they were messages. Hidden within these markings was something far older than anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a discovery of natural beauty or rare wildlife. This was something that reached across centuries, perhaps millennia. It was a relic of a time far beyond the known history of the Everglades. Theo's mind raced. What was this place? How had these stones come to be here, in the midst of a swamp that, to the modern eye, seemed inhospitable? He reached out to touch one of the stones, his fingers brushing against the cool surface. The moment he made contact, the air seemed to hum with energy. The ground beneath him shifted, as though the earth itself was reacting to his touch. For a split second, the atmosphere around him thickened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to happen. The sky overhead darkened in a sudden shift. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the swamp, though no storm was in sight. Theo stood frozen, unsure whether this was some natural phenomenon or the first sign of something far more extraordinary. The device's reading spiked again, faster now. A flash of light lit up the clearing, and before Theo could react, the world around him flickered, like a television losing signal. Then, just as quickly, it stabilized. But when Theo blinked, the clearing in front of him wasn't the same. The trees, the stones, the air itself, it all felt different. Time had fractured, and he had just become a part of it. Theo staggered back, his heart racing. His breath caught in his throat as the clearing around him shimmered, the environment fluctuating like a poorly tuned television screen. The stones, once inert, seemed to hum with life now, their symbols glowing brighter as if they were trying to communicate with him. A faint breeze stirred, rustling the foliage around him, but the air felt colder than before, heavy with a weight he couldn't understand. The momentary disorientation passed, and Theo's senses sharpened. He wasn't alone. The sound of movement in the underbrush reached his ears, faint but distinct. It was too deliberate to be an animal, and the rhythmic pattern suggested something, or someone, was approaching. His hand instinctively reached for the pocket-sized device at his belt, but it was useless now, its screen flickering erratically as if the quantum tracker had been affected by the temporal disruption. Panic set in. What had just happened? Was this a dream, or had he truly crossed over into another time? Theo's mind raced with the possibilities. The Everglades, with its treacherous swamps and dense vegetation, had always been a place steeped in mystery and folklore. But this was something beyond the natural realm. He had to understand what was happening, but every instinct told him to leave, to turn around and run. Yet, he didn't. Instead, he advanced toward the center of the clearing, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The symbols on the stones were now more pronounced, as though they were alive, pulsating in sync with his heartbeat. He reached out and traced one of the carvings, his fingers grazing over the surface. The symbols felt warm under his touch, like the skin of something ancient and waiting. Then, without warning, The air cracked with a loud snap, like the sudden eruption of an invisible force. Theo jerked back, his muscles tensing as the ground beneath him quivered. He turned around, expecting to see the same forest he had walked through only moments before. But the scene was different now. The trees were taller, their trunks more twisted and gnarled, their leaves large and unfamiliar. A thick mist clung to the ground, creeping around his ankles as he tried to make sense of the sudden change. The very atmosphere felt altered, as if time itself had twisted in a way he couldn't comprehend. The distant sound of water, a river or stream, reached his ears, though the swamp had been eerily silent just moments ago. Everything around him felt both familiar and impossibly alien. He tried to steady his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. He needed to figure out where, or rather, when he was. Looking down at the ground, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. His footprints, which should have been visible in the soft swamp soil, were gone. The ground had reset itself. It was as though his presence here had been erased, swept away by the forces of time itself. A loud crack broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices. Human voices, growing louder. Theo's first instinct was to hide, to remain unseen, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the realization that he had stepped into a moment in time that wasn't his own, and he was a stranger here. The voices grew clearer, accompanied by the rustling of leaves and the creaking of branches. Theo ducked behind the largest stone, hoping to remain unnoticed. From his position, he could see the figures emerging from the mist. They were dressed in a style he had only read about in history books. Colonial explorers, their clothing an odd mix of Spanish and early American frontier attire. They spoke in a language that felt both familiar and strange, their words flowing like a melody, laced with an accent that was centuries old. There was no mistaking it. These were not figures from the present. They were real people from a different era, and they had appeared in the swamp as if summoned by some unseen force. Theo's mind raced. What was this place? Had he somehow been transported to the early days of exploration in the Americas? Could this be the moment when the swamps of Florida had first been encountered by European explorers in the 16th century? He stepped out from behind the stone, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. The explorers moved with purpose, seemingly oblivious to his presence, their eyes focused on the trail ahead. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, stopped and pointed toward a cluster of trees in the distance. His companions nodded, and the group moved in that direction, their footsteps slow but deliberate. Theo's heart pounded as he watched them disappear into the thickening mist. He needed to follow them, to understand what was going on, but he also needed to be cautious. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself and disrupt whatever delicate balance of time he had just stumbled upon. But as he took a step forward, something caught his eye, a faint, glowing light at the edge of the clearing. It flickered like a firefly, barely visible in the dense fog. The light seemed to pulse, beckoning him toward it. Theo knew he had to investigate. He couldn't ignore it. With one last glance at the disappearing explorers, he made his decision. He would follow the light. But with every step, the air seemed to grow colder, and the ground felt less stable beneath his feet. It was as though the swamp itself was shifting around him, distorting time and space, testing his resolve. Was he really walking through time? Or was this all just some strange trick of the mind, a side effect of the quantum tracker malfunctioning? No matter the answer, the path ahead was clear. He had to uncover the truth of the Everglades, and he had to do it quickly. Theo moved cautiously toward the glowing light, the mist wrapping around his ankles as he advanced. The swamp had become a labyrinth of strange sensations. Time felt warped, like an old vinyl record skipping over cracks in its grooves. The sounds of the explorers had faded, but he could still hear the whisper of the wind and the faint, rhythmic pulse of something in the distance. It wasn't just the environment that had changed. It was the very fabric of reality. The temperature was dropping with each step, and yet the swamp remained its usual humid, steamy self. It was as though he was walking through multiple layers of time, each one overlapping, impossible to decipher. As he neared the source of the light, he noticed that the glow seemed to intensify, as if drawing him in. It wasn't a natural light. There were no fireflies or moonlit reflections in the water that could explain it. The light itself felt electronic, almost artificial. He paused for a moment, his hand brushing against the cool surface of a nearby tree, its bark slick and almost velvety to the touch. The light was now unmistakable, a small orb hovering a few feet above the ground, casting an ethereal glow around the area. It bobbed gently, like a will-o'-the-wisp, flickering and shifting in the air. Theo's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was technology. His heart thudded in his chest as he stepped forward, extending a hand toward the orb. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a shockwave of energy surged through him, a cold pulse that traveled from his fingertips, up his arm, and through his entire body. His mind was flooded with a cascade of images, flashes of landscapes, cities, and buildings that he didn't recognize. The future? Past? Or something else entirely? It was impossible to say. The orb shimmered, then suddenly vanished, leaving behind only a faint residue of its glow, lingering in the air like smoke. Theo stood motionless, his senses heightened, trying to process what had just happened. The world around him had shifted again. The fog had thickened, and now, in the distance, he could hear the sounds of machinery, engines, whirring motors, the unmistakable hum of advanced technology. He turned, his eyes scanning the swamp, trying to locate the source of the noise. Through the trees, a faint silhouette appeared, a vehicle, not unlike a futuristic ATV, moving slowly through the fog. It wasn't the kind of machine that belonged in the swamps of Florida. It was sleek, metallic, with a design that screamed of advanced technology, too advanced for the present day. Theo's heart skipped a beat. Was this a vehicle from the future? Had the rift in time opened yet again, pulling something or someone from another era? He had to find out. Without hesitation, he began walking toward the vehicle, keeping a safe distance as he observed it from behind the trees. The vehicle stopped, and a figure emerged, obscured by the mist. The person seemed to be scanning the area, as if looking for something or someone. Theo felt a knot form in his stomach. Had this person somehow crossed the rift, too? Or were they part of something else, a part of the strange anomaly that had brought him here? He crouched low, pressing himself into the undergrowth, trying to remain unseen. The figure moved toward the center of the clearing, where the stones were still visible, their carvings glowing faintly in the mist. Theo's breath caught in his throat. This was the same place he had just left, but now it felt even more surreal, more out of place. The figure was kneeling before the stones, studying them intently. It was as if they were searching for something, just like he had been. Theo's mind raced. What was going on here? Was this some sort of temporal convergence? Were the stones acting as a gateway between different points in time? Could they be responsible for the strange lights, the fluctuations in reality? He had no answers, only more questions, and the sinking feeling that he was in the middle of something far bigger than himself. The figure seemed to reach out toward the stones, their hands hovering over the surface, and Theo's eyes narrowed. He could see a faint light pulse from the figure's body, illuminating the area for a split second. It was as though the stones were responding to them. And then, just as quickly as the light appeared, it vanished. The figure stood, seemingly satisfied with what they had found, and turned to leave. Theo couldn't let them go. There was something crucial happening here, and he needed to know more. He waited until the figure was out of sight, then followed, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The last thing he wanted was to alert them to his presence. As he moved through the swamp, the environment continued to shift. The trees grew larger, their roots more twisted, the air thicker with mist. The swamp no longer felt like a physical place. It felt like a realm that existed outside of time, a space where the laws of reality didn't apply. Each step he took felt like a leap into the unknown. Soon, the silhouette of the vehicle reappeared in the distance, parked at the edge of a clearing. The figure was standing by it, fiddling with something on the side of the machine. Theo crept closer, careful not to make a sound. He was almost there, almost close enough to see what was going on. And then, just as his hand brushed against a nearby tree, a sharp crack echoed through the swamp. Theo froze, his heart in his throat. Had the figure heard him? Had he made a mistake? No, the sound hadn't come from the figure. It had come from behind him. Theo turned, his mind racing. What was that sound? A crack of branches, the rustling of leaves. Something, or someone, was approaching. The sound was growing closer, unmistakable now. The air around Theo seemed to freeze in place, as if the very swamp was holding its breath. He quickly ducked behind a thick cluster of ferns, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to control his breathing. The rustling continued, steady and deliberate. It was not an animal, it was something human, or at least humanoid. Theo's mind raced. Who else could be out here, in the depths of the Everglades, at this hour? The strange temporal fluctuations, the mysterious figure, the glowing light. It was all connected. He was sure of it. But who else was aware of this rift in time? He hadn't expected to encounter anyone else here, certainly not someone who seemed as intent on studying the stones as he was. Peering through the ferns, Theo's eyes widened as the source of the noise came into view. Another figure emerged from the mist, wearing a dark, tight-fitting suit that looked out of place in the swampy wilderness. Unlike the explorer from earlier, this figure was armed, carrying some kind of high-tech device slung across their back, glowing faintly with the same eerie light that had surrounded the stone carvings. The figure moved with purpose, eyes scanning the ground beneath them. Theo could see their breath form in the cool air, sharp and rapid, as if they were searching for something. They passed within mere feet of Theo's hiding spot, and he held his breath, hoping they wouldn't spot him. But it wasn't the figure that Theo's attention was drawn to. It was the unmistakable hum of a device in the air, a sound that echoed throughout the swamp, reverberating through the trees. The figure stopped, pausing mid-step as the hum grew louder, almost like a call, a beacon that resonated through time itself. Theo instinctively crouched lower, pressing himself further into the underbrush, watching as the figure raised the device on their back and activated it. The air shimmered once more, distorting in a wave of light, and the swamp itself seemed to respond. The trees, the leaves, the water, they all bent in unison, shifting and warping as though they were being drawn toward the figure's technology. The device, whatever it was not just affecting the present moment. It was altering the very environment, stretching the boundaries of the swamp beyond what Theo could comprehend. The mist thickened, swirling with unnatural speed, and Theo felt the familiar pulse of energy fill the air again. The hum grew louder until it drowned out all other sounds, and Theo's vision began to blur. It was as if the swamp had become an extension of the figure's technology, wrapped in a cocoon of temporal disruption. Theo's breath quickened. Was this what had caused the anomalies in the Everglades? Was this the reason for the strange disturbances in time, the strange rifts he had been sensing? Was this technology from the future, or perhaps even the past? His mind was spinning, trying to piece together what he was witnessing, but his focus kept returning to the figure and their device. He needed answers. But how much of this could he understand? The figure continued to manipulate the device, their movements precise, each action coordinated as if they were resetting the very fabric of time itself. Theo couldn't tear his eyes away. He had come here searching for the cause of the disturbances, but now it seemed as though he had stumbled upon something far more significant. This was no simple glitch in the fabric of time. It was an engineered manipulation of reality itself, and whoever this person was, they were at the center of it all. As the hum reached its peak, something strange happened. The light from the device began to fracture, breaking apart into 1,000 shards of energy that danced in the air, casting jagged reflections across the swamp. Theo felt a sharp tug in his chest, an overwhelming sensation of being pulled toward the epicenter of the distortion. Then, the world around him began to splinter. Time fractured before his eyes. The Everglades, once a single, stable reality, now existed in multiple layers, with the present, past, and future bleeding together in a kaleidoscope of images. One moment, he could see the lush wetlands of the 2070s. The next, he was back in the 16th century, surrounded by explorers and indigenous tribes. And then, he was in the distant future, with towering glass structures and skies filled with flying vehicles, none of which he recognized. The figure was still there, standing at the heart of the storm, controlling the distortion with their device. Theo felt himself drawn forward, like a moth to a flame, his body moving despite his mind screaming at him to stay hidden. Every instinct told him to run, to escape this fractured world, but something was compelling him to stay, to witness the full scope of what was unfolding. In that moment, time seemed to stop entirely. The air was thick with energy, the distortions in the swamp swirling around him like a vortex. Theo could hear his heart pounding, the beat echoing through the chaos. It was as if the very concept of time itself had unraveled, leaving him in a space where nothing was certain, nothing was stable. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the distortion collapsed. The hum faded into silence, and the air settled back into the stillness of the Everglades. The swamp, once again, felt like a place of peace, though Theo could feel the lingering tension in the air, the aftereffects of whatever had just transpired. Theo stood up slowly, his legs unsteady from the sudden shift in reality. The figure was gone, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their presence. The device, too, had vanished, and with it, the rift in time. But Theo knew, deep down, that the Everglades held more secrets than he could have ever imagined. And as he looked out across the swamp, he realized that the world he had returned to was not the same one he had left. Time, it seemed, had a way of changing everything. Stonehead. Dr. Helena Ferris stood on the windswept plain before Stonehenge, her mind racing faster than the sleek Tesla expanse parked behind her. The ancient stones, towering and enigmatic, loomed in the twilight, their weathered surfaces covered in strange symbols, half erased by time. Her fingers itched to make the final adjustments on the device that would bridge centuries and worlds. For years, she had worked in secrecy, far from the prying eyes of the world, collecting data from various ancient sites, tracing the threads of history and technology that connected them. Most people believed Stonehenge to be just a mysterious monument, its true purpose lost to the sands of time. But Dr. Ferris knew better. Stonehenge wasn't just a relic. It was a beacon, a portal, and she was the first to unlock its secret. Her lab in London had been abuzz with theoretical calculations and clandestine experiments, but it wasn't until she had partnered with Triton Industries, a corporation famous for its groundbreaking technological advancements, that she had access to the resources necessary for her mission. They had been the first to recognize the potential of Stonehenge's energy, the subtle fluctuations in the electromagnetic field surrounding it. Aided by cutting-edge technology, her team had painstakingly reconstructed the device capable of manipulating time itself. As the wind howled around her, Helena checked the coordinates one last time, ensuring the alignment of the stones, the planetary positions, and the calibration of the device. A soft hum filled the air, and she stepped back. The ground trembled slightly beneath her feet. The portal was activating. With a deep breath, she pressed a single button on her wrist. The iPhone 5000 strapped to her arm pulsed with energy, and the ground before her cracked open like a wound in the earth. The stones around her shimmered, and suddenly, the air was thick with a strange, unfamiliar force. It felt as though the fabric of reality itself was bending. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the portal sprang to life with a deafening roar, and a beam of light shot upward, disappearing into the sky. The stone circle seemed to warp, the stones bending and stretching as though they were not bound by the laws of physics. Time, space, and energy converged in a swirling vortex of color and sound. Helena's heart pounded in her chest. The portal was active. She was standing on the threshold of another world, another time. The time traveler stepped forward. The ground was warm beneath her boots, the air smelling of earth, wet grass, and the faint tang of something ancient. She squinted into the bright light, her eyes adjusting as she entered the portal. In an instant, the world around her changed. The towering stones, which had seemed so immovable moments ago, now looked out of place, set against a barren, open landscape. Stonehenge was still there, but the world she stood in was nothing like she had expected. The sky was different, darker, tinged with hues of purple and red, as if it were not quite the same one she had known. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone circle. It was a land of endless grasslands, dotted with ancient trees, but the civilization she had expected to find, the one that built this monument, was nowhere to be seen. Helena's first instinct was to look for clues, to gather data. This was what she had come for, answers. She crouched by the stone altar in the center of the circle, scanning it with her portable Sony laserscope, a high-tech tool that could detect the faintest traces of radiation and energy signatures. The readouts were bizarre. There were high levels of temporal energy, far beyond anything that should have existed in this era. The stone had been touched by something otherworldly, something from the future. Suddenly, something caught her eye. A flash of movement. She turned, expecting to see a wild animal or perhaps a trick of the light. But what she saw left her breathless. A vehicle, sleek and impossible, was parked just beyond the stone circle. It wasn't the usual ancient chariot or anything even remotely plausible for this time. No, this was a car. An Aston Martin, futuristic in design, its metallic surface gleaming in the strange light, but clearly out of place. The logo glowed faintly, a symbol of technology that hadn't even been dreamed of yet in this time period. The doors of the car opened, but no one was inside. Helena stood frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. This was impossible. How could a car from her time have appeared here, in the ancient past? This was more than a simple temporal anomaly. This was a breach, a fracture in the timeline. Someone or something had been here before her. She approached cautiously, her hand reaching for the car's Appletech interface, but before she could touch it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed in her mind. "You are not the first." Helena recoiled. The voice was strange, not coming from any visible source. It reverberated in her skull, as if the landscape itself was alive, sentient, aware of her intrusion. The message was clear. Someone else had been here before. The wind whipped across the plain, as if the world itself was pushing her away. She took a step back from the car, her mind racing with questions. Who had traveled through time before her? Was it another scientist? Someone else from the future? Or was there something else, something more ancient and dangerous at play? The portal behind her flickered, its light growing dim, unstable. It was time to leave. Helena turned and ran back to the Tesla expanse, her thoughts spinning. She needed answers. The presence of the Aston Martin, the strange voice, the energy readings, it all pointed to something far greater than she had anticipated. And as she approached the car, she knew one thing for sure. The journey was far from over. The timeline had been disrupted, and the past, present, and future were on a collision course. The world she knew was unraveling, piece by piece, and she had just become a part of it. As the Tesla expanse roared back toward the heart of modern London, Dr. Helena Ferris felt an unease settle deep in her chest. The distant hum of the portal remained with her, a constant reminder of the fragile line she was walking between dimensions. She had made it back, but something had followed her. She could feel it in the air, in the way the world seemed just slightly off. The streets of London looked almost identical to how she had left them, bustling with activity as crowds weaved through their day-to-day routines. But beneath the familiar hum of contemporary life, Helena could sense that things were beginning to shift. Time wasn't supposed to behave like this. The Stonehenge portal had opened a tear that rippled through reality itself. And though the city around her seemed unchanged, Helena knew better. The laws of physics and causality had been altered by her experiment. She just wasn't sure how, or what consequences lay ahead. She pulled her car into a private parking garage below the Triton Industries building, her mind racing with new data and concerns. The company had funded her research, offering the most cutting-edge technology available, including the AppleTech HoloFrame, a device capable of real-time data analysis and projection of potential future events based on present conditions. It was still a prototype, but its predictive algorithms had become more accurate over time. Helena's hand hovered over the device, but instead of receiving the usual seamless connection, the screen flickered and buzzed with static. A chill ran down her spine. It was as if the device didn't know where it was anymore, as if it was reaching into a timeline that had already diverged. She quickly moved to her office, but before she could sit down, an urgent call came through. It was from Triton Industries. Dr. Ferris, a voice crackled over the line, distorted with a strange static. "We need you to come in immediately. There's been a situation. You won't believe this, but something's not right." Helena's heart skipped a beat. She knew what it meant. Something was already shifting within the corporation. They had been tracking her every move, of course, but now it seemed like the fabric of reality was warping around their ambitions. She hadn't expected them to move so quickly. She grabbed her Sony digital pad, scanning the latest data feeds as she made her way to the lab. The company's vast network of servers, running on quantum computing infrastructure, was now pinging with anomalous readings, time fluctuations, paradoxes. But the real question was, how had the future known about her experiment? The answer came in the form of an encrypted file sent from an anonymous source, marked only with the symbol of an eye, a symbol Helena had seen before, back in the Stonehenge ruins. It was the symbol of the ancient order, the ones who had originally planted the portal in the stone circle. Echelon, Helena whispered aloud. Echelon was not just a secret government project. It was a shadowy group operating through the centuries, using time travel to influence events from behind the scenes. They had their hand in everything, from politics to technology, and they were always one step ahead. Now, it seemed they had been monitoring her every move since she had first activated the portal. "Dr. Ferris," the voice on the phone interrupted her thoughts. "We're seeing things, disturbances in the field. It's as if the timeline is trying to reset itself. You need to come to the lab. It's urgent." She could feel the weight of the situation press down on her chest. Time was unraveling. What had started as an innocent experiment to explore the ancient past was now a tangled mess of past, present, and future colliding with a terrifying force. The portal had not only opened a passage to ancient times, it had somehow breached the fabric of space-time itself. Her mind raced as she hurried through the corridors of Triton Industries, the flashing lights of the digital ads on the walls barely registering. Everything felt like a blur, as though the world around her was starting to lose focus. Sony virtual reality glasses placed on display in the showroom outside caught her attention, their sleek design a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her head. When she reached the lab, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The team had already started working on the problem. Triton Industries was at the forefront of quantum computing, but even their most advanced equipment was showing signs of instability. The projections on the giant screens flickered wildly, showing splits in the timeline, multiple versions of history playing out simultaneously. Helena immediately began to analyze the data streams, looking for the anomaly. Her eyes locked onto one particular fluctuation, the Aston Martin from the past. Its appearance had been the first sign of a larger problem. Something was leaking from the future. The car was only the tip of the iceberg. The truth was clear now. The past wasn't the only thing at risk. The future had been infected, too. If the timeline continued to distort, everything would collapse. But what terrified Helena more than anything was the realization that someone, or something, was intentionally guiding these changes. Whoever had left the symbols at Stonehenge, whoever had placed the Aston Martin in the past, was still watching, manipulating events from the shadows. With no time to waste, she activated the Appletech holoframe again, and as it synchronized with the quantum computer, the real-time projections flickered into focus. The timelines were already crossing. In one projection, the world of 2143 was decaying, unraveling into a chaotic future filled with ruins, while in another, ancient civilizations were beginning to build tools that shouldn't exist yet. Helena had to make a choice. Did she continue to study the portal, or was the damage beyond repair? She couldn't stand by and watch the destruction unfold. She had to act. But even as she stepped toward the central control panel, she felt a familiar pulse in the air. It was the portal. It was calling her back. As she looked at the data, one final image appeared on the screen. The glowing eyes of the symbol she had seen at Stonehenge. The Oracle, a figure who had been manipulating events long before Helena had even realized it. And the truth was clear now. This wasn't just a journey through time. This was a war for control of reality itself. Helena's footsteps echoed through the pristine halls of Triton Industries as she made her way deeper into the labyrinth of research facilities. Her mind raced, but her body felt detached, as if moving through the shifting sands of a dream. Each step she took felt heavier, weighed down by the knowledge that everything she had worked for, the portal, the mysteries of time, was unraveling before her eyes. Her team was in disarray. Scientists, researchers, and engineers huddled around screens, analyzing streams of conflicting data. Some were glued to their quantum computers, frantically typing in an attempt to stabilize the cascading anomalies, while others sat motionless, staring at projections of collapsing timelines and apocalyptic futures. The once bright and sleek facility now seemed like a tomb, filled with the hum of failing technology. Helena stood at the center of it all, her mind absorbed in the patterns emerging on the holographic display before her. The future she had returned to, the one she had always known, was already beginning to fracture. Cities in the sky, powered by quantum energy, flickered out of existence in one timeline, while in another, the ancient ruins of Stonehenge stood in the center of a world that looked utterly alien. There were too many possibilities, too many branching paths. One thing was certain. The future she had known was slipping through her fingers. She grabbed her Sony digital pad, desperately pulling up data from across the quantum network, trying to find some kind of thread to follow. The portal had connected her to the past, but it had also exposed the fragility of time. It was no longer a linear sequence. There were now multiple versions of the future existing side by side, colliding and merging. It was as if the very fabric of the universe had begun to rip apart, and in the center of it all was a single, haunting question. Who or what was controlling this chaos? As she scrolled through the endless streams of data, her eyes caught an encrypted message, a symbol, simple yet ominous. An eye, the same symbol that had appeared on the Aston Martin, the same symbol she had seen etched into the stones of Stonehenge. She was not alone in this struggle. Someone was watching, pulling the strings behind the scenes. The Oracle, the figure who had manipulated time before, was now poised to exert control over all of it. Helena knew she couldn't do this alone. Dr. Ferris. The voice broke through her thoughts. It was Alan, one of her senior researchers, his face pale and strained. We've intercepted a transmission from the future. It's from the Oracle. Helena's heart skipped a beat. The Oracle was real, and it had found her. The message, Alan continued, it's warning us. If the portal remains open, the timeline will collapse completely. But if we close it, everything we've discovered will be lost. All the knowledge, all the technology, gone. Helena clenched her fists. This was the crossroads. The portal was the key to everything, but it was also the reason everything was falling apart. The Oracle had known this, of course. It had been guiding the collapse from the beginning, nudging the timeline to this breaking point. The Oracle had long been a figure in the shadows, manipulating events, ensuring the path was carved just so. But the Oracle didn't know her. Helena Ferris had seen what no one else had. She had witnessed the cracks in the universe, and she had the power to heal them. She would not let this ancient being control her fate, or the fate of time itself. We need to go to the source, Helena said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her mind. We need to shut down the portal from the other side. Alan looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. But we can't. It's too dangerous. The portal's unstable. If you go through, then I'll go alone, Helena interrupted, her voice firm. I've seen enough to know that if I don't act now, it'll be too late for all of us. She turned toward the nearest exit, her resolve hardening. The Appletech holoframe she carried buzzed in her hand, the connection to the quantum servers growing faint, its once precise projections now riddled with errors. It was as if the very device that had guided her through her research was starting to fade, like a dream slipping away. But it didn't matter. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop. As she made her way to the Triton Industries time travel module, an advanced piece of technology designed to transport individuals through the portal, Helena's mind raced with what she had learned. The Oracle had left its mark on history, manipulating time in subtle ways, planting the seeds for this crisis long before she ever came into the picture. The Oracle's ultimate goal wasn't just to control time, it was to own it. And if Helena didn't stop it now, the Oracle would succeed. She stepped into the time travel module, the sleek Rolls-Royce future drive-like technology humming softly as it powered up. The machine was designed to navigate the instability of the portal, but even now, Helena could feel the fluctuations. Time itself was being bent, and every second she spent in this unstable reality brought the entire world closer to collapse. She programmed the module to take her back to Stonehenge, but this time, she wasn't going to the past. She was going into the future, the heart of the Oracle's domain. She had to confront it. She had to destroy the source of the madness. As the module's engines roared to life, Helena braced herself. The swirling vortex of time and space surrounded her, pulling her in from all sides. The future was no longer a place, it was a battlefield. And in this battle, she would either reclaim control of time or watch as everything she had known vanished forever. Helena's hands gripped the controls of the Triton Industries time travel module as it hurtled through the swirling vortex of space and time. The machine's hum reverberated through the air, and the entire cabin seemed to vibrate with the force of the portal's energy. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to abandon the mission, but she couldn't. The Oracle had to be stopped. If she hesitated for even a moment, the world she knew would disintegrate. The module ripped through time like a knife through fabric, bending the very laws of reality. Past, present, and future were no longer distinguishable. Images of cities, both ancient and futuristic, flashed before her eyes. The London she had known, with its bustling streets and neon lights, dissolved into the towering spires of a future metropolis. Stonehenge shifted in and out of focus, appearing both in its original form and as a crumbling ruin in an alternate timeline. It was a chaotic kaleidoscope of possibilities, each one pushing the limits of her understanding. But in the center of it all, she felt the pull of the Oracle, the being whose very existence was tied to the manipulation of time, was growing stronger. The closer she came to its domain, the more unstable the portal became. The walls of the time module shook violently as the vortex expanded, threatening to consume everything in its path. Helena closed her eyes, focusing on the mission at hand. She had come this far. She wasn't going to let the Oracle, or anyone else, control the future. She could feel the presence of the Oracle growing, a subtle but unmistakable force, its energy like a dark shadow looming just ahead. The time module lurched, and Helena opened her eyes. She was no longer in the swirling maelstrom of time. Instead, she found herself suspended in an eerie, desolate version of the future. The landscape stretched out before her, barren and lifeless, with the remnants of once great cities scattered across the horizon. It was a world that had been ravaged by the very forces she had set in motion. The future she had known, the cities in the sky, the technology that had powered the world, everything was gone. In its place was a wasteland. She stepped out of the time module, her boots crunching against the dust-covered ground. The air was thick and still, as though time itself had grown weary. Far in the distance, she saw the faint silhouette of a figure, tall, cloaked, and surrounded by a shimmering, ethereal light. The Oracle. Helena's heart raced as she made her way toward it. Every step felt heavier, as if the very act of moving through this broken reality was taxing her body and mind. The Oracle was waiting for her, its presence like a magnet, pulling her closer. It spoke without words, its voice echoing in her mind, its influence so powerful that it felt as though the very space around her was warping in response. "You've come," the Oracle's voice intoned, not through sound, but through feeling, a resonance that vibrated in her chest. "You cannot stop what has already begun. Time is mine to command." Helena's grip tightened on the Appletech holoframe strapped to her wrist, the device now flickering erratically. She could feel the time distortion surrounding her, the very air vibrating with instability. The Oracle was not just a being of power. It was a force of nature, an entity that had existed for eons, weaving itself into the fabric of time itself. "Why?" Helena demanded, her voice steady despite the overwhelming presence of the Oracle. "Why manipulate time? What do you want?" The Oracle's form shifted, its shimmering presence growing stronger. "I want what you have always sought, Helena Ferris. Control. I have guided history, shaped the course of events. But you have unraveled it. You have seen the cracks, the fractures. And now, you seek to fix what cannot be fixed." Helena took a deep breath. The Oracle's words were laced with arrogance, but she could feel something else beneath them, fear. The Oracle, for all its power, was terrified. Terrified that someone like Helena, someone who understood the true nature of time, might undo everything it had built. "I don't seek control," Helena replied, her voice calm and resolute. "I seek balance." The oracle's presence faltered, its form flickering for a brief moment. For a fraction of a second, it seemed unsure, vulnerable. But that hesitation was all Helena needed. She activated the Appletech holoframe, the device flashing to life, its energy resonating with the distortions in the air. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to destroy the oracle. She was going to banish it, to sever its link to the timeline. The portal above her flickered, its energy becoming unstable. Time was collapsing around her, and she could feel it in her bones. Every moment she hesitated, the fabric of reality stretched thinner, closer to breaking. With a decisive motion, Helena pressed the central button on the Appletech holoframe. The device hummed to life, its energy surging through her body. Light enveloped her, and for a brief moment, she felt like she was everywhere and nowhere at once, her consciousness expanding across time. The oracle screamed, not in pain, but in rage, as the light from the device tore through the very foundation of its existence. The world around her began to warp and distort, the timeline splintering like a shattered mirror. The oracle's influence faded, its form crumbling into nothingness, consumed by the energy from the device. As the light faded, Helena found herself back in the time module, her body shaking from the immense strain. The vortex had calmed, the portal stabilizing, and the timeline had returned to its proper course. But the world she knew was not the same. Time had healed, but there were scars, subtle differences that could not be undone. The future had been preserved, but it had changed, irrevocably altered by the journey she had undertaken. Helena Ferris sat back in the module, her heart pounding, as the landscape of her world settled around her. The path she had chosen had come at a cost, but it was a price she was willing to pay. The oracle was gone, and time was once again in balance. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape.